In the glamorous streets of Monaco, where million-dollar cars shine under designer lights, one man huddles under a bridge in torn clothes. He carries a secret that would shock the racing world. He's the son of Formula One legend Gilles Villeneuve, Marco. Villeneuve once had everything. Natural speed that made veteran drivers jealous. A famous last name that opened every door in racing. A future brighter than Monaco's harbor lights. But a single crash at the same corner where his father died destroyed it all. Fear replaced speed. Shame buried talent. Pride became his prison. For 3 years, Marco has lived on the streets, carrying one thing more precious than food or shelter: an unopened letter from his father, written before the race that killed him. Marco is terrified to read it, convinced it will prove his father loved racing more than family. On this stormy night, everything is about to change, because Lewis Hamilton is walking home from dinner, and he's about to make a choice that will save 2 lives and restore faith in what it means to be human. The rain hit Monaco like bullets against the pavement. Lewis Hamilton pulled his jacket tighter as he walked quickly through the narrow streets near the harbor. Dinner with his Mercedes team had run late, and now the storm was getting worse by the minute. Lightning flashed across the Mediterranean Sea. Thunder rolled between the tall buildings that lined Monaco's famous coastline. Lewis had walked these streets hundreds of times, but tonight felt different. The rain made everything look gray and lonely. He took a shortcut under the old stone bridge near Port Hercules. This was where the biggest yachts docked during the Monaco Grand Prix. Tonight, it was empty, except for the sound of water dripping from the ancient stones above. That's when he saw him. A man sat huddled against the bridge wall. His clothes were torn and wet. A thin blanket covered his shoulders, but it wasn't keeping him dry. The man's head was down, like he was trying to become invisible. Lewis almost kept walking. Monaco was full of wealthy people who didn't like to see problems on their perfect streets. Most people would pretend not to notice a homeless man under a bridge. But something made Lewis stop. Maybe it was the way the man sat so straight, even though he was clearly suffering. Maybe it was the expensive-looking jacket wrapped around his shoulders, even though it was falling apart. Or maybe it was just that Lewis remembered what it felt like to be an outsider. "You okay, mate?" Lewis asked softly. The man looked up. His eyes were bright blue, the kind of blue that stood out even in the dim light under the bridge. His face was thin from not eating enough, but his bone structure was strong. Noble, even. There was something familiar about those eyes. Something that made Lewis think of old racing magazines and championship trophies. "I'm fine," the man said, quietly. His voice had a slight French accent. "Just waiting for the rain to stop." Lewis studied the man's face more carefully. The strong jaw. The way he held his head high despite his situation. The proud look in his eyes that said he didn't want pity. "What's your name?" Lewis asked, sitting down on the wet pavement beside him. The man seemed surprised that Lewis would sit down in his expensive suit. He hesitated before answering. "Marco," he said finally. "Marco Villeneuve." Lewis felt his heart skip a beat. Villeneuve. That name was famous in Formula One history. Gilles Villeneuve had been one of the greatest drivers ever to race. He died in a crash in 1982 when Lewis was just 7 years old. Gilles' son, Jacques, won the F1 championship in 1997. But Lewis remembered reading about another son, a younger boy who stayed out of the spotlight while Jacques became famous. "Marco Villeneuve," Lewis repeated slowly, trying to keep his voice calm. Your father was Gilles Villeneuve. Marco's bright blue eyes filled with tears. He nodded, but didn't speak. Louis couldn't believe what he was hearing. The son of one of racing's greatest heroes was sitting under a bridge in Monaco, homeless and alone. How could this happen? What had gone so wrong? "Come with me," Louis said, standing up and offering his hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry." Marco shook his head firmly. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Louis replied. "It's what drivers do for each other. We take care of our own." Marco looked at Louis more carefully now, studying his face in the dim light. "You're Lewis Hamilton," Marco said with surprise. "Seven-time world champion." "That's right," Louis said. "And you're the son of a legend. That makes us family, in a way." Marco seemed to think about this. The rain was getting heavier, and water was starting to run in small rivers along the bridge. "Why? Would you help me?" Marco asked. "You don't even know me." Louis thought about his answer. He remembered his own difficult times, the struggles to make it in Formula One as one of the few black drivers, the people who helped him when he needed it most. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it," Louis said simply. "And because that's what your father would have done." Something in Marco's expression changed when Louis mentioned Gilles. The proud mask slipped for just a moment, showing deep pain underneath. "You knew my father?" Marco asked. "I knew of him," Louis said. "Every driver knows the Villeneuve story. Your father was brave and fast and honest. He never gave up, no matter." "What?" Marco pulled the torn racing jacket tighter around his shoulders. Louis could see now that it was old but high quality. The kind of jacket only someone connected to Formula One would have. "He died when I was 12, Marco said quietly. "I've been trying to live up to his memory ever since." "And how's that working out?" Louis asked gently. Marco looked around at the bridge, at his wet clothes, at the situation he was in. A bitter smile crossed his face. Not so well, obviously. Lightning flashed again, lighting up both their faces. In that bright moment, Louis saw something else in Marco's eyes. Something that looked like a secret. Something heavy and painful that he was carrying alone. "There's more to this story, isn't there?" Louis asked. Marco nodded slowly. "There's something about my father's crash. Something no one knows. Something that changes everything." Louis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "What do you mean?" But Marco had already closed up again. The moment of openness was over. "Not here," Marco said, looking around nervously. "Not like this." Louis understood. Whatever Marco was carrying was too big, too important to share under a bridge in the rain. It needed the right time and place. "Then come with me," Louis said again. "Let's get you dry and fed. Then you can tell me whatever you need to tell me. This time." Marco didn't argue. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting in the cold. Louis noticed he moved carefully, like someone who had been hurt and never quite healed properly. As they walked through the rain toward Louis's apartment, Marco was quiet. But Louis could feel the weight of whatever secret he was carrying. It seemed to hang in the air between them like a storm cloud. At the apartment building, as they waited for the elevator, Marco spoke again. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care." Louis nodded. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. And whatever Marco needed to tell him about his father's death was going to change both their lives forever. The elevator. Doors opened, and they stepped inside together. Outside, the storm continued to rage over Monaco, but Louis felt like they were moving toward something important. something that had been waiting a long time to be discovered. The elevator climbed slowly to the top floor. Lewis watched Marco's reflection in the polished doors. Even wet and tired, there was something regal about the way he stood, like royalty that had fallen on hard times. Lewis's apartment overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. On clear days, you could see the famous Monaco racing circuit from the windows. Tonight, the storm made everything dark except for the lightning that lit up the waves. "Sit anywhere you like," Lewis said, hanging up his wet jacket. "I'll make some coffee." Marco stayed standing near the door, dripping water onto the expensive marble floor. He looked around the apartment like he didn't belong there. The furniture was modern and clean. Racing trophies lined the shelves. Everything spoke of success and money. "You have a beautiful home," Marco said quietly. "It's just a place to sleep." "Between races," Lewis replied from the kitchen. "Coffee or tea?" "Coffee, please." Lewis started the machine and watched Marco through the open doorway. He was studying a photograph on the wall. Lewis celebrating his first championship win at a McLaren in 2008. "You were so young," Marco said. 23, Lewis said, bringing 2 steaming cups to the living room. "About the same age you would have been when you started racing professionally." Marco took the coffee, but didn't sit down. "How did you know I raced?" "Lucky guess," Lewis said. "Most racing families, all the children try it. It's in the blood." Finally, Marco sat on the edge of the couch. He wrapped his hands around the warm cup like it was the first heat he'd felt in days. "My father died when I was 12, Marco began. Jacques was already 18 and racing in junior formulas. He was the golden son, you know? The one everyone expected to carry on the Villeneuve name." Lewis nodded. He remembered when Jacques won the championship in 1997. The whole racing world had celebrated the return of the Villeneuve family to the top. "What about you?" Lewis asked gently. Marco's eyes grew distant. "I tried racing too. Started in karting when I was 14, then Formula 3 when I turned 18. "Were you fast?" A sad smile crossed Marco's face. "I was very fast. Some people said I was faster than Jacques at the same age. My lap times were incredible." Lewis could hear the pride in Marco's voice mixed with deep pain. "What happened?" Lewis asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't. "Be happy." Marco set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "I crashed. A bad crash during practice at Spa-Francorchamps in 2003. Lewis knew Spa well. It was one of the most dangerous tracks in all of motorsport. The same track where Marco's father had his fatal accident in 1982. "The same corner?" Lewis asked quietly. Marco nodded. "Eau Rouge. Almost the exact same spot where my father died 21 years earlier." The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Lewis could imagine how terrifying that must have been for Marco. "The doctors said I could race again after I healed," Marco continued. "My injuries weren't permanent, but something inside me broke that day." Marco pulled out a worn photograph from his jacket pocket. It showed a young man in a red racing suit standing next to Gilles Villeneuve. The family resemblance was unmistakable. The same bright blue eyes, the same strong jaw. "This was taken a week before my father died," Marco said, passing the photo to Lewis. "I was just 12, but I already knew I wanted to race like him." Lewis studied the photograph. Gilles looked proud and happy standing next to his younger son. There was love in his eyes. "After my crash, every time I got in a racing car, I saw my father's accident," Marco explained. "I kept hearing the sound of metal hitting metal, the sound of impact." "Did you try to get help?" Lewis asked. "I tried everything. Therapy, meditation, different doctors. Nothing worked. Every time I reached racing speed, The fear took over. Marco stood up and walked to the window. Lightning flashed across the harbor below. I tried other jobs in racing, he continued. Worked as a mechanic for different teams. I was good at it too, but everywhere I went, people expected me to be like my father and brother. Lewis understood. The pressure of living up to a famous family name could crush someone's spirit. When I couldn't live up to those expectations, I felt like a failure, Marco said, like I was dishonoring my father's memory by being afraid. So you started drinking? Lewis guessed. Marco's shoulders sagged. It started small. Just a beer after work to calm my nerves. Then wine with dinner. Then drinking alone, in my apartment. How long? Lewis asked. 3 years of heavy drinking. Lost job after job. Lost my apartment in Montreal. My mother tried to help, but I was too proud to accept it. Too ashamed of what I'd become. Marco returned to the couch, but he sat on the very edge, like he might need to run away. When did you become homeless? Lewis asked gently. 6 months? Ago, Marco replied. I came to Monaco because my father won here in 1981. I thought maybe being close to his memory would help me find my way back. Lewis looked at the racing jacket Marco still wore. Up close, he could see it was vintage Ferrari gear from the early 1980s. That's his jacket, isn't it? Lewis asked. Marco nodded. One of the few things I kept when I lost everything else. I wear it to feel close to him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, the storm was starting to calm down. There's something else, Marco said suddenly. Something I found in my father's personal papers. Something that changes everything about his death. Lewis leaned forward. This was the secret Marco had hinted at under the bridge. What did you find? Marco's eyes filled with tears. The night before my crash at Spa, I was going through his old papers, looking for inspiration, trying to connect with his memory. And I found a letter, Marco whispered, written in my father's handwriting, addressed to me, written just before the race where he died. Lewis felt his heart racing. Have you read it? Marco shook his head. I've carried it with me for 3 years, but I've never opened it. Why not? Marco looked out at the dark sea. Because I'm afraid of what it might say. What if he knew he was going to die? What if he chose racing over his family? Over me? Lewis understood now. Marco wasn't just carrying the weight of his own failed racing career. He was carrying the fear that his father had loved racing more than his children. Where is the letter now? Lewis asked. Marco reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, but the seal was still intact. Lewis could see Gilles Villeneuve's handwriting. For Marco. Maybe it's time to find out what your father really wanted to tell you, Lewis said gently. Marco stared at the letter, like it might explode. What if it destroys the last good memories I have of him? Or what if it gives you the peace you've been looking for? Marco held the letter for a long moment, then put it back in his jacket. Not tonight, he said. I'm not ready yet, Lewis nodded. Some truths had to wait for the right moment. You can stay here as long as you need, Lewis offered. The guest room is yours. Thank you, Marco said, but I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Lewis replied firmly. You're family, racing family. And family takes care of each other. For the first time since Lewis found him under the bridge, Marco smiled genuinely. My father used to say that, Marco said. Racing family is forever. As they prepared for bed, Lewis couldn't stop thinking about the unopened letter. Whatever Gilles Villeneuve had written to his younger son 23 years ago held the key to Marco's healing. But first, Marco had to find the courage to face whatever truth was waiting inside that envelope. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Louis's apartment windows. The storm had passed, leaving Monaco sparkling clean. Marco woke up in a real bed for the first time in months. Louis was already awake, making breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and toast filled the apartment. "How did you sleep?" Louis asked when Marco appeared in the doorway. "Better than I have in years," Marco admitted. He was wearing clean clothes that Louis had given him. They were a little big, but they made him look human again. "Good. We're going shopping today." "I told you. I don't need charity," Marco said quickly. Louis poured coffee into 2 cups. "It's not charity. Consider it an investment in a friend." After breakfast, they drove into Monte Carlo's shopping district. Louis's Mercedes moved smoothly through the narrow streets lined with expensive stores. At the first clothing shop, people immediately recognized Louis. Tourists asked for selfies, while shop workers treated him like royalty. Marco tried to hide behind racks of suits and shirts. "I used to be somebody too," Marco said quietly, as they walked back to the car with bags of new clothes. Louis stopped walking. "What do you mean, used to be?" "Before the crash, before the drinking, people knew my name. Racing magazines wrote articles about me. Team owners wanted to meet me." Marco looked at the expensive cars driving past them. Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren. The kinds of cars he used to drive fast around racetracks. "Now I'm just the homeless guy you're helping," Marco said sadly. Louis put a hand on Marco's shoulder. "You're still somebody. You're still Gilles Villeneuve's son. That racing blood is still in your veins." They got back in the car, but Louis didn't start driving right away. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Sebastian? It's Louis. I have someone I want you to meet." "Yes, today if possible." "Trust me, you'll want to meet him." Marco looked confused. "Who's Sebastian?" "Sebastian Vettel. He runs programs to help young drivers. But he also helps older drivers who need a second chance." An hour later, they were driving through the hills outside Monaco. Louis turned into a small racing facility that Marco hadn't noticed before. It was simple compared to big Formula One tracks, but it had everything needed for serious driving. Sebastian Vettel was waiting for them next to a bright yellow go-kart. He was shorter than Marco expected, with kind eyes and a friendly smile. "Sebastian, this is Marco Villeneuve," Louis said. Sebastian's eyes widened. "Villeneuve? As in?" "Gilles was my father," Marco said quietly. Sebastian extended his hand for a firm handshake. "Your father was a hero to me when I was growing up. I watched videos of his races over and over." Marco seemed surprised by Sebastian's genuine respect. "Louis tells me you used to race," Sebastian continued. "Used to," Marco emphasized. "I haven't driven competitively in years," Sebastian gestured toward the go-kart. "This isn't competitive. It's just for fun. When was the last time you drove anything fast?" Marco stared at the cart like it might bite him. "I can't. I haven't driven since my crash." "It's just a cart," Louis said gently. "Like riding a bicycle." Marco's hands started shaking. The same fear that had ended his racing career was back. "What if I crash again?" Marco asked. "Then you get up and try again," Sebastian said simply. "That's what your father would have done." For several minutes, Marco just stood there looking at the cart. Louis and Sebastian waited patiently, not pushing him. Finally, Marco picked up the helmet Sebastian had brought for him. "Just a few laps," Marco said. "Slow ones." Sebastian helped Marco adjust the seat and explained the cart's simple controls. Louis watched as Marco's hands gripped the steering wheel. Take your time, Sebastian called out, as Marco drove slowly onto the track. At first, Marco was very careful. He took corners at half speed and kept the cart well within its limits. But gradually, something started to change. After 5 slow laps, Marco began pushing a little harder. The cart started moving more smoothly through the corners. His body, language relaxed. By the 10th lap, Marco was driving like he remembered how. The cart danced through the turns with precision and grace. His lap times were getting faster with each circuit. Lewis and Sebastian watched in amazement as Marco found his rhythm. It was like watching someone remember how to breathe. When Marco finally stopped the cart, he sat still for a long moment before taking off his helmet. Tears were streaming down his face. "I felt him," Marco said, his voice breaking. "I felt my father with me out there." Lewis and Sebastian rushed over to him. Marco was crying, but he was also smiling. "How do you feel?" Sebastian asked. "Alive," Marco said. "For the first time in years, I feel alive." They sat at a picnic table next to the track, while Marco processed what had just happened. The fear was still there, Marco explained, but it wasn't stronger than the joy. "I'd forgotten how much I loved driving." Lewis realized that Marco needed more than just housing and food. He needed purpose. He needed to feel connected to racing again. "There are other ways to be part of racing besides being a professional driver," Lewis said. Sebastian nodded. "I know racing schools that need instructors, karting programs that need coaches, teams that need technical advisors." Marco looked interested. "You think someone would hire me?" "Are you kidding?" Sebastian said. "You're a Villeneuve. You have natural speed and you understand cars. Plus, you've been through struggles that would help you connect with students." Lewis pulled out his phone again. "I'm making some calls. There are people in the racing world who would love to work with you." Over the next hour, Lewis contacted several racing organizations. Marco listened as Lewis explained his situation to potential employers. "I want to help you get back into racing somehow," Lewis told Marco after finishing his calls. "Not necessarily as a driver, but as part of the racing family." Marco looked uncertain. "Why would you do all this for me?" Lewis thought about his own journey in Formula One. He remembered struggling to find his place as one of the few black drivers. He remembered people who had helped him when he needed it most. "Because racing people take care of each other," Lewis said. "When someone in our family is down, we help them get back up." Sebastian added, "Plus, you have something special to offer. You understand both success and failure. That makes you a better teacher." As the sun began to set over the Monaco hills, Marco felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. "There's still the letter," Marco said quietly, touching his jacket pocket, where the envelope waited. "What letter?" Sebastian asked. Lewis explained about the unopened message from Gilles Villeneuve. "Maybe now that you've remembered who you are as a driver, you're ready to learn what your father wanted to tell you," Sebastian suggested. Marco pulled out the yellowed envelope and held it in his hands. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble. "What if it changes everything?" Marco asked. "What if it sets you free?" Lewis replied. But Marco wasn't ready yet. He put the letter back in his pocket. "Soon," he said. "But first, I want to see if I can really do this. If I can be part of racing again." Lewis smiled. "Then let's find out." As they drove back to Monaco, Marco felt like a different person than the homeless man Lewis had found under the bridge. The racing spirit that had been buried under years of fear and shame was starting to wake up. But the biggest test was still coming. Whatever his father had written in that letter would either complete his healing or break him completely. For now, though Marco was content to take things one day at a time, he had remembered how to drive. Soon, he would have the courage to remember how to face the truth. Over the next week, Marco stayed in Louis's guest room. Every morning, Louis left for his training while Marco explored Monaco on foot. The city looked different when you weren't hiding under bridges. Louis had arranged for Marco to work part-time at Monaco Racing Academy, a school where wealthy tourists learned to drive expensive cars safely. The owner, Felipe, was an old friend who owed Louis several favors. "Just try it for a week," Felipe had told Marco during their meeting. "If it doesn't work out, no hard feelings." Marco's first day was on a Tuesday morning. He arrived early. At the racing school, wearing one of his new shirts and clean jeans, his hands were shaking again. The school had a small track and a garage full of beautiful cars. Ferrari 488s, Porsche 911s, McLaren 570s. The kinds of cars Marco used to drive at racing speed. "You'll start with basic instruction," Felipe explained. "Teach people how to handle powerful cars without crashing them." Marco's first student was James, a businessman from London. James had bought his teenage son a Ferrari for his birthday and wanted to learn how to drive it properly first. "I've never driven anything faster than my family sedan," James admitted nervously as they walked toward a bright red Ferrari 488. Marco felt his own nervousness mixing with James's fear. What if he couldn't remember how to teach? What if his fear came back when he got behind the wheel? But as soon as Marco sat in the driver's seat, something clicked. The car felt familiar under his hands, like coming home after a long trip. "First, we learned to listen to the car," Marco told James as they drove slowly around the track. "Every sound, every vibration means something." Marco demonstrated smooth acceleration and gentle braking. He showed James how to feel the car's weight shifting through corners. "The car wants to go fast," Marco explained, "but it needs you to be calm and controlled. Speed without control is just danger." James was a quick learner. Under Marco's patient guidance, he began to understand the connection between driver and machine. "You're a natural teacher," James said after their session. "Where did you learn to drive like that?" Marco hesitated. He wasn't ready to share his racing background with students yet. "I grew up around cars," Marco said simply. By the end of the first week, Marco had taught 6 different students. Each lesson went better than the last. His confidence was returning slowly, like a flower growing toward sunlight. Felipe was impressed. "You have a gift for this," he told Marco. "Students feel safe with you, but they also learn fast." In the IB evenings, Louis and Marco sat on the apartment balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. Marco talked about his day while Louis shared stories from his own racing experiences. "I've been thinking about what my father would say about this job," Marco said one evening. "What do you think he would say?" Louis asked. Marco watched a yacht sail slowly across the harbor. He always said racing wasn't about being the fastest. It was about understanding the connection between man and machine. "Sounds like that's exactly what you're teaching." Marco nodded. "Today I helped a woman from Germany learn to drive her husband's Porsche. She was terrified at first, but by the end she was smiling and laughing." Louis could see the change in Marco. His shoulders were straighter, his eyes were brighter. The homeless man he'd found under the bridge was disappearing, replaced by someone who belonged in the racing world. But late at night, Louis sometimes heard Marco walking around the apartment. The letter from his father still haunted his thoughts. One evening, Marco pulled out the wooden box he'd kept hidden in his belongings. Inside were his father's personal papers, photographs, and race notes. "These are all I have left of him," Marco explained to Louis. The family kept most of his trophies and cars, But I got his private papers. Louis looked through the photographs. Young Gilles with baby Jacques. Gilles teaching a very young Marco to ride a bicycle. Racing pictures from the 1970s and early 1980s. At the bottom of the box was the sealed envelope with Marco's name on it. He wrote this 3 days before his last race. Marco said quietly, "I found it hidden in his desk drawer when I was cleaning out his things." Louis studied the envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, but Gilles' handwriting was still clear and strong. "What are you afraid it says?" Louis asked gently. Marco's eyes filled with tears. What if he knew he was going to die? What if he chose to race anyway, knowing he might not come home to Jacques and me? Louis understood the fear. If Gilles had known the danger and raced anyway, it would mean he'd chosen racing over his family. Or what if it says something completely different? Louis suggested. Marco held the envelope like it might explode in his hands. "I've built my whole life around the idea that my father was a hero who died doing what he loved. What if that's not true? Would that change how much you loved him?" Marco thought about this question for a long time. "I don't know. Maybe. I've spent so many years trying to live up to his memory." The envelope sat on the table between them like a time bomb. Whatever Gilles Villeneuve had written to his younger son 23 years ago held the power to heal Marco or destroy him. "When I crashed at Spa, I thought it was fate," Marco continued. "Like the Villeneuve family was cursed to crash at that corner. But what if it wasn't fate? What if my father just made a bad choice?" Louis reached across the table and put his hand on Marco's shoulder. "Your father was human. Humans make mistakes. That doesn't make them less heroic." Marco wiped his eyes. "I know that in my head, but my heart is scared." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching lights twinkle across Monaco's harbor. The students at the racing school ask me about my background sometimes, Marco said, changing the subject. "I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth, that you're a good driver who wants to help them learn safely. But they'll want to know more. They'll ask about my racing career." Louis understood Marco's dilemma. He was proud of his speed and skill, but ashamed of how his career had ended. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding from who you are," Louis suggested. "You're Marco Villeneuve. You have racing in your blood. That's something to be proud of." Marco picked up the letter again. "I think this is connected to everything. My fear, my drinking, my feeling like a failure. Until I know what's in here, I can't really move forward." "Then maybe it's time to open it." Marco stared at the envelope for a long moment. Then he carefully broke the wax seal. But as he started to unfold the letter, his phone rang. It was Philippe from the racing school. "Marco? Sorry to call so late. I have a special request for tomorrow. A VIP client wants private lessons. He specifically asked for you." Marco put the letter down, still folded. "Who is it?" "Charles Leclerc. He heard about your teaching from some of his friends." Marco's heart stopped. Charles Leclerc was one of the best drivers in Formula One, a Ferrari driver, a champion. "He wants lessons from me?" Marco asked in disbelief. "Apparently, word is getting around that we have a very special instructor, someone who really understands racing." After Marco hung up, he looked at the letter again, but the moment for opening it had passed. "Tomorrow I teach Charles Leclerc how to drive," Marco said, still shocked. Louis smiled. "See? You're not just some failed racer. You're someone current F1 drivers want to learn from." Marco carefully put the letter back in the wooden box. "Maybe after tomorrow, when I'm feeling stronger." But Lewis wondered if Marco would ever feel strong enough to face whatever truth his father had left for him. Some secrets were easier to carry than to confront. The next morning, Marco woke up before his alarm. Today he would teach Charles Leclerc, one of the fastest drivers in the world. His hands were shaking again, but this time it was excitement mixed with nervousness. Lewis was already awake, drinking coffee in the kitchen. "Big day," Lewis said, with a smile. "What if I'm not good enough?" Marco asked. "What if Charles realizes I'm just a failed driver, pretending to be an instructor?" Lewis set down his coffee cup. "Marco, you're not pretending anything. You're a natural teacher who happens to have incredible speed. Charles wouldn't have asked for you specifically if he didn't respect your abilities." Marco arrived at the racing school 30 minutes early. He wanted everything to be perfect. The Ferrari 488 was cleaned and ready. The track was clear. Marco reviewed his lesson plan one more time. Charles Leclerc arrived exactly on time, driving a simple rental car instead of something flashy. He was younger than Marco expected, with friendly eyes and an easy smile. "You must be Marco," Charles said, extending his hand. "I've heard amazing things about your teaching." "Thank you for coming," Marco replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What would you like to work on today?" Charles looked at the Ferrari, then at the track. "I want to understand how to teach my younger brother to drive fast safely. He's 18 and thinks speed is everything." Marco felt relieved. This wasn't about impressing Charles with his own speed. It was about sharing knowledge. "Speed without wisdom is dangerous," Marco said. "Let's start with the basics." For the next 2 hours, Marco showed Charles different teaching techniques: how to explain weight transfer to new drivers, how to build confidence gradually, how to recognize when someone is pushing too hard too fast. "Your brother will want to go fast immediately," Marco explained as they drove around the track. "But first, he needs to understand that the car is talking to him constantly." Charles was an excellent student. He asked smart questions and practiced each technique carefully. "You make this look easy," Charles said during a break. "Where did you learn to teach like this?" Marco hesitated. He still wasn't comfortable sharing his racing background. "I've been around cars my whole life," Marco said simply. But Charles sensed there was more to the story. "You drive like someone who's raced professionally. Your body position, the way you feel the car's limits, that doesn't come from just teaching tourists." Marco felt trapped. He didn't want to lie, but he wasn't ready to explain his failed career either. "I tried racing when I was younger," Marco admitted. "It didn't work out." Charles nodded, understanding. "Racing is hard. Only a few people make it to the top. But that doesn't mean the speed wasn't real." After the lesson, Charles surprised Marco by asking him to join him for lunch at a small cafe near the harbor. "I want to tell you something," Charles said as they sat at a table overlooking the water. "My career almost ended before it started." Marco looked surprised. Charles was one of the most successful young drivers in Formula One. "I crashed badly during my second year in Formula 2, Charles continued. "Broke my wrist and damaged my confidence. For months, I was afraid every time I got in a car." "What happened?" Marco asked. "I had to learn that fear wasn't my enemy. Fear could actually make me a better driver if I listened to it instead of fighting it." Marco felt a connection to Charles that he hadn't expected. They both understood what it felt like to lose confidence behind the wheel. "The way you teach shows you understand fear," Charles said. "You help people work with it instead of ignoring it. That's a rare gift." That afternoon, Charles invited Marco to join him at the Monaco Grand Prix hospitality area. The race weekend was still a month away, but teams were already preparing. Walking through the paddock, Marco felt overwhelmed. He hadn't been to a Formula One event since his crash 10 years ago. The familiar sounds and smells brought back memories both good and painful. Charles introduced Marco to several other drivers. Max Verstappen was there testing a new helmet design. Daniel Ricciardo was reviewing data from recent practice sessions. "This is Marco," Charles told them. "He's the best driving instructor in Monaco. He taught me some incredible techniques today." Marco felt embarrassed by the praise, but the other drivers were genuinely interested in meeting him. "What's your background?" Max asked. Before Marco could answer, an older man walked up to their group. It was Tony Rossi, a retired Ferrari mechanic, who had worked with some of the greatest drivers in history. "Excuse me," Tony said, looking at Marco carefully. "Are you Marco Villeneuve?" Marco's heart stopped. He nodded slowly. "Your father was the bravest driver I ever worked with," Tony said with emotion. "But more than that, he was the kindest man. In the paddock, always made time for everyone, from team owners to tire changers." The other drivers looked at Marco with new understanding and respect. "Villeneuve?" Daniel said. "As in Gilles Villeneuve?" Marco nodded again, feeling exposed, but also strangely relieved. "Your father was a legend," Max said. "I watched videos of his races when I was learning to drive. For the next hour, mechanics and team members who remembered Gilles came over to share stories with Marco. They talked about his father's speed, but also his character and kindness. He never acted like he was better than anyone, one mechanic recalled. Used to help younger drivers learn the tracks. These conversations helped Marco see his father's legacy in a new way. Gilles was remembered not just for being fast, but for being a good person who cared about others. "Your father would be proud of what you're doing," Tony told Marco before leaving. "Teaching others to drive safely is just as important as racing fast." As the sun began to set over Monaco, Charles and Marco sat in the empty grandstands overlooking the famous street circuit. "How does it feel to be back in the F1 world?" Charles asked. Marco looked at the track where his father had won in 1981. "Scary, but good. I'd forgotten that racing is about more than just speed. It's about the people, the family." "Do you miss racing competitively?" Charles asked. Marco thought about the question. "I miss the speed sometimes, but I don't miss the pressure or the fear of not being good enough." Charles nodded. "Maybe you found something better. Teaching gives you all the joy of speed without the stress of competition." As they walked back through the paddock, Marco felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he belonged in the racing world again. But that night, back at Lewis's apartment, the letter from his father seemed to call to him from the wooden box. All day, people had shared beautiful memories of Gilles Villeneuve. They painted a picture of a man who was not only fast, but also kind and caring. Marco pulled out the envelope and held it in his hands. Maybe he was finally ready to learn what his father had really wanted to tell him. But once again, he put the letter back unopened. The fear of disappointment was still stronger than his curiosity. "Tomorrow," he told himself. "Tomorrow I'll be brave enough." But tomorrow never seemed to come when it came to facing the biggest truths. 3 weeks passed. Marco had become the most popular instructor at Monaco Racing Academy. Students requested him specifically, and word was spreading through the wealthy Monaco community about the mysterious teacher who made fast cars feel safe. But the letter still sat unopened in its wooden box. One evening, Lewis found Marco sitting on the balcony, staring at the envelope in his hands. "You can't keep carrying this forever," Lewis said gently, sitting down beside him. "I know," Marco replied. "But every time I try to open it, I imagine the worst possible thing my father could have written." Louis thought about his own fears and difficult moments. "What's the worst thing you think it says?" Marco's voice was barely a whisper. That he knew racing would kill him, but he chose it anyway. That speed was more important to him than coming home to Jacques and me. "And what's the best thing it could say?" Marco had never considered this question. "I don't know. I've only imagined the worst." Louis made a decision. "I think it's time you visit Spa-Francorchamps." Marco looked shocked. "The track where I crashed? Where my father died? Why? Would I want to go there?" "Because you can't heal from something you're still running away from," Louis said. "Face the place where it all went wrong. Then maybe you'll be ready to face whatever your father wrote." Marco's hands started shaking. "I haven't been back to Spa since my accident. I swore I never would." "You don't have to go alone," Louis offered. "I'll drive you there. We'll face it together." That night, Marco couldn't sleep. He walked around Louis's apartment, thinking about Belgium and the track that had changed his life forever. The next morning, Louis was loading his Mercedes with overnight bags. "I called Philippe and told him you need a few days off," Louis said. "The drive to Spa takes about 8 hours. We can stay overnight and come back tomorrow." Marco looked terrified, but also determined. "If I do this, will you help me open the Bertie letter when we get back?" "If you want me to, yes." The drive through France toward Belgium was quiet at first. Marco stared out the window at the countryside, lost in memories. "Tell me about your crash," Louis said as they crossed into Belgium. Marco took a deep breath. "It was my 3rd season in Formula 3. I was having the best weekend of my career. Fastest in both practice sessions, Louis kept driving steadily north toward the Ardennes Mountains, where Spa-Francorchamps waited. The weather was perfect that day," Marco continued. "Dry track, good visibility. I was feeling confident, maybe too confident. What happened? I was pushing hard in qualifying, trying to get pole position. Coming through Eau Rouge at about 180 kilometers per hour, the car just snapped sideways. Louis knew Eau Rouge well. It was one of the most famous and dangerous corners in all of motorsport. A sweeping left-right combination that drivers took at incredible speeds. The car hit the barriers almost exactly where my father crashed 21 years earlier," Marco said quietly. "For a few seconds, lying in the wreckage, I thought I was going to die, just like he did. But you didn't die." "No, but something inside me did. The part that wasn't afraid of speed." As they got closer to Spa, Marco grew more nervous. His hands were shaking again, and he kept checking to make sure the letter was still in his jacket. "Pocket? Done?" Spa-Francorchamps appeared through the trees like a sleeping giant. The track cut through the Belgian forest, with elevation changes and high-speed corners that challenged even the best drivers in the world. Marco hadn't seen the track in 10 years. It looked smaller than he remembered, but also more intimidating. "We can leave right now if you want," Louis offered as they parked near the track entrance. "No," Marco said firmly. "I need to do this." They walked through the entrance and onto the track itself. It was a quiet day, with no racing scheduled, just some tourist activities, and a few people walking around the circuit. Marco led Louis to the section called Eau Rouge. This was where everything had gone wrong for both him and his father. Standing at the spot where he'd crashed, Marco began to tell Louis the full story. "I was having a perfect lap," Marco remembered. "Everything was flowing smoothly. Then, coming up the hill through Eau Rouge, something went wrong with the suspension." Marco pointed to the exact spot where his car had hit the barriers. Fresh paint covered the old damage, but the memory was still vivid. The car went sideways at 180 kilometers per hour. I had maybe 2 seconds to think before hitting the wall. Louis could imagine how terrifying those 2 seconds must have been. What did you think about in those 2 seconds? My father, Marco said immediately. I thought about how he must have felt in his final moments. Whether he was scared, whether he thought about Jacques and me. They stood in silence for several minutes, looking at the corner that had changed both their lives. After the crash, lying in the hospital, I kept thinking about fate. Marco continued. Like the Villeneuve family was cursed to crash at this corner. Louis understood now why Marco had stopped racing. It wasn't just about fear. It was about feeling like he was destined to follow his father to an early death. But your father's crash was mechanical failure, not fate, Louis said gently. And your crash was just bad luck. Racing is dangerous, but it's not destiny. They spent the next hour walking around the entire track. Marco pointed out other corners where he remembered racing, sharing stories that made him smile instead of cringe. At the chicane section, Marco talked about his first victory at Spa in Formula 3. At the long straight, he remembered drafting behind other cars at 300 kilometers per hour. I was good at this, Marco said with surprise, as if remembering something he'd forgotten. I really was fast. You still are fast, Louis replied. Speed doesn't go away. It just gets buried sometimes. By the time they reached the main straight again, Marco seemed different. The fear was still there, but it wasn't overwhelming anymore. My father died here, but he also lived here, Marco said, looking at the track with new eyes. Some of his happiest moments were on this circuit. They had dinner at a small restaurant in the nearby town of Stavelot. Marco talked about his father's racing career, sharing stories Louis had never heard. He won his first Grand Prix at a track in Canada, Marco said. The whole country celebrated. But he told my mother the victory felt empty because Jacques and I weren't there to see it. He loved racing, but he loved his family more, Louis observed. Marco nodded slowly. That's what everyone always said about him. But I've been so focused on his death, I forgot about how he lived. That night, in their hotel room, Marco pulled out the letter from his father. The envelope looked even more fragile after their emotional day at the track. I think I'm ready, Marco said, but his hands were still shaking. Louis sat across from him, offering silent support. Whatever it says, it doesn't change who your father was, or who you are. Marco carefully broke the wax seal that had kept the letter closed for over 20 years. The paper inside was yellowed with age, covered in Gilles Villeneuve's distinctive handwriting. Marco began to read silently, his eyes moving across the French words. Louis watched as Marco's expression changed from fear to confusion to something that looked like relief. Tears started streaming down Marco's face. What does it say? Louis asked gently. Marco looked up, his eyes wide with shock. Everything I believed about my father's death was wrong. What do you mean? Marco's voice was shaking as he began to translate the letter out loud. It says he was planning to retire from racing after that season. He was going to quit Formula 1 to spend time with Jacques and me. Louis felt his own heart racing. He was going to retire? He writes that watching me play with toy cars in the garage made him realize what was really important, Marco continued, reading. He says he'd been racing for glory and crowds, but he wanted to come home and be the father we deserved. Marco set the letter down, crying too hard to continue reading. He was coming home, Louis. He wasn't choosing racing over family. He was choosing family over racing. The truth that Marco had been afraid to face for so many years was the opposite of what he'd feared. His father hadn't died because he loved speed more than his children. He'd died while planning to give up speed for his children. The crash that killed him happened during the race where he planned to announce his retirement. Marco said through his tears, he never got the chance to come home. Lewis moved around the small table to put his hand on Marco's shoulder. The weight that Marco had carried for 20 years was finally lifting. "Now you know," Lewis said softly. "Your father chose you." For the first time since that terrible day at Spa 10 years ago, Marco felt free. Marco wiped his eyes and picked up the letter again. His hands were steadier now. The worst fear was behind him. Whatever else his father had written, it couldn't be more important than knowing Gilles had chosen family over racing. "There's more," Marco said, continuing to read the French words out loud for Lewis. "My dear Marco, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and you have grown up without your papa. I am writing this before what I know will be my final race. Not because I plan to die, but because I finally understand what is most important in life." Lewis listened carefully as Marco translated each word with growing emotion. "I have been racing for glory, for victory, for the cheers of crowds. But yesterday, watching you play with your toy cars in the garage, I realized I have been racing for the wrong reasons." Marco paused, remembering himself as a 12-year-old boy, playing with miniature Formula One cars while his father prepared for races. "After this season, I am retiring from Formula One," Marco continued reading. "I want to spend time with you and Jacques to teach you about racing, not because you must follow in my footsteps, but because you love it. I want to see you grow up. I want to be the father you deserve." Marco stopped reading and looked at Lewis with wonder. He was really going to quit. This isn't just a nice idea. He had made the decision. Lewis felt amazed by what they were discovering. "Keep reading." Marco's voice grew stronger as he continued translating his father's words. "I know people will say, Gilles Villeneuve could never stop racing. That speed was my drug. But you, my son, are a greater victory than any race I could ever win." These words hit Marco like a physical blow. For years, he had believed he wasn't important enough to his father. Now he was learning the opposite was true. The speed, the danger, the glory. None of it matters if I am not here to share life with my family. I have seen too many drivers die young, leaving their children to wonder if their fathers loved racing more than them. Lewis understood now why this letter was so important. Marco had spent his entire adult life wondering exactly that question. "I love racing, Marco, but I love you more," Marco read, his voice breaking again. "After Zolder, I am coming home for good. We will build go-karts together. I will teach you to drive safely, for fun, not for fame." Marco set the letter down for a moment. Zolder was the race where he died. He was planning to announce his retirement after that weekend. Lewis tried to imagine how different Marco's life would have been if Gilles had survived to retire as planned. "There's more," Marco said, picking up the letter again. "If something happens to me before I can retire, I want you to know, you were never second to racing in my heart. You were always first." The words seemed to heal something deep inside Marco. The guilt and inadequacy he had carried for 20 years began to dissolve. "I also want you to know that if you choose to race, do it for joy, not for expectations. Do it because the speed makes you happy, not because you carry the Villeneuve name. And if you choose not to race, that is fine too. You do not owe the IBDR world your speed. Louis realized this was exactly what Marco needed to hear. Permission to be himself instead of living up to impossible expectations. Be brave, but be smart, Marco continued reading. Be fast, but be safe. Most importantly, be yourself. Your papa loves you always, Gilles. Marco folded the letter carefully and sat back in his chair. The hotel room was quiet, except for the eep sound of rain starting to fall outside. He knew, Marco said quietly. He knew that I might struggle with his legacy. What do you mean? He wrote this letter specifically for me, not for Jacques. He knew I would be the one who needed to hear these words. Louis thought about the timing. How did he know to write this just before his last race? Marco looked out the window at the rain. Maybe he didn't know he was going to die. Maybe he was just finally ready to be honest about what mattered most. How? Does this change things for you? Marco considered the question carefully. Everything I've been afraid of was wrong. I thought my father died because racing was more important than family. But he was actually planning to give up racing for us. And your crash at Spa? It wasn't fate or a family curse. It was just an accident that could have happened to anyone. Marco pulled out a photograph of himself as a boy standing next to his father. He had carried it in his wallet for years, but now he looked at it with new understanding. I've spent 10 years feeling guilty for not being brave enough to race, Marco said. But my father didn't want me to be brave. He wanted me to be smart and safe. Louis smiled. Sounds like you've been following his advice without knowing it. What do you mean? You're teaching people to drive fast safely. You're helping them find joy in speed without taking stupid risks. That's exactly what your father wanted. Marco realized Louis was right. Without knowing it, he had been honoring his father's true wishes all along. I need to call Jacques, Marco said suddenly. Why? Because he's been carrying guilt too. He thinks he failed as the older brother by not helping me through my struggles. But the truth is, we were both trying to live up to an image of our father that wasn't even real. Marco used Louis's phone to call his brother in Canada. It was late in Montreal, but Jacques answered immediately. Marco, is everything okay? I found Father's letter, Jacques, the one he wrote to me before he died. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Jacques' voice, very quiet. What did it say? Marco spent 20 minutes telling his brother about the letter's contents. He could hear Jacques crying through the phone. He was coming home, Jacques said finally. All these years, I thought he died because he couldn't give up racing. We both thought that, Marco replied. But we were wrong. Where are you now? In Teton, Belgium. I went back to Spa for the first time since my crash. How was it? Marco looked at Louis, who was giving him an encouraging smile. Healing. Finally healing. They talked for another hour, sharing memories of their father that felt different. Now, Gilles hadn't been a man obsessed with speed who couldn't stop racing. He had been a father who loved his children enough to walk away from everything he was famous for. When Marco hung up the phone, he felt lighter than he had in years. Jacques wants to come visit me in Monaco, Marco told Louis. We haven't spent real time together since before my crash. That sounds perfect. Marco carefully folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. But this time, he didn't hide it away. Instead, he placed it on the table where he could see it. I want to frame this, Marco said. Not to hide it, but to remember it. Louis understood. The letter was no longer a source of fear. It was proof of love. What happens now? Louis asked. Marco looked out at the rain, which was beginning to slow down. Tomorrow, they would drive back to Monaco, and Marco would return to his new life as a driving instructor. But everything felt different now. "Now I stopped trying to be someone I'm not," Marco said. "I stopped feeling guilty for not being a racing champion. I start being proud of who I actually am." "And who is that?" Marco smiled. "I'm Marco Villeneuve. I'm the son of a man who loved his family more than fame. I'm a teacher who helps people find joy in driving. And I'm someone who finally understands what my father really wanted for me." The rain stopped completely, and moonlight began to shine through the hotel window. For the first time in 10 years, Marco felt completely at peace. 3 months later, Marco stood in front of his own apartment in Monaco. It was smaller than Louis's place, but it felt like home. The walls were decorated with photographs of his father, the framed letter, and pictures of his students at the racing school. Louis helped Marco move the last boxes from his car. "How does it feel to have your own place again?" Louis asked. "Perfect," Marco said, looking around the simple living room. "For the first time in years, I know exactly who I am and where I belong." Marco's new apartment was walking distance from Monaco Racing Academy, where he now worked full-time as the chief driving instructor. Felipe had promoted him after seeing how much his students loved learning from him. "You have a gift that can't be taught," Felipe had told Marco. "Students trust you because you understand both the joy and the danger of speed." Marco's reputation as a teacher had spread throughout Monaco and southern France. Wealthy car enthusiasts requested him specifically. But more importantly, Marco had started a special program for young people who couldn't afford expensive driving lessons. Every Saturday morning, Marco took his mobile racing simulator to local schools. Kids who had never been in a fast car got to experience the thrill of driving safely. "Racing isn't about being reckless," Marco told a group of teenagers at a school in Nice. "It's about being in complete control while going fast. Speed with wisdom." The teenagers loved Marco's teaching style. He made safety sound exciting instead of boring. One of his regular students was Sophie, a 16-year-old girl whose father owned a successful business in Monaco. When Sophie first came to the racing school, she was terrified of driving fast. "My friends say girls can't drive as well as boys," Sophie had told Marco during her first lesson. "Your friends are wrong," Marco replied simply. "Speed has nothing to do with being male or female. It's about understanding the connection between you and the machine." Over several months, Marco worked patiently with Sophie. He taught her how to feel the car's weight shifting through corners, how to brake smoothly at the end of long straightaways, how to build speed gradually instead of rushing. Sophie improved quickly under Marco's guidance. Her father was amazed by the change in his daughter's confidence. "She used to be afraid of everything," Sophie's father told Marco. "Now she's excited about driving and talks about maybe studying automotive engineering." Marco realized he had found something better than being a racing champion. Helping young people discover their potential felt more rewarding than any trophy. Louis often stopped by the racing school to watch Marco teach. The transformation was remarkable. The homeless man Louis had found under a bridge was now confident, successful, and genuinely happy. "You look different," Louis told Marco one evening as they walked along Monaco's harbor. "I feel different. For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be someone else." They stopped at a cafe where they could see the famous Monaco racing circuit in the distance. The Grand Prix was next weekend, and crews were already setting up barriers and grandstands. "Are you going to watch the race?" Louis asked. Marco nodded. "Jacques is coming to Monaco for the weekend. We're going to watch it together." This would be the first time the Villeneuve brothers had attended a Formula one race together since Marco's accident. Jacques was flying in from Canada, where he worked as a television commentator. "How do you feel about seeing Jacques again?" Louis asked. "Excited? We've been talking on the phone every week since I found the letter. It's like we're brothers again, instead of strangers." Louis was happy to see Marco reconnecting with his family. The letter from their father had healed both brothers. The next day, Marco organized a special event at the racing school. It was a charity driving day where people could learn to drive fast cars safely, with all the money going to homeless shelters in Monaco. The event sold out quickly. Local newspapers wrote stories about it, focusing on Marco's journey from homelessness to helping others. But Marco asked the reporters not to use his last name in the articles. "I want to be known for what I do now, not for who my father was." Marco explained to the journalist. Louis admired this decision. Marco was creating his own identity, separate from the Villeneuve racing legacy, but still connected to the values his father had taught him. Over 50 people participated in the charity event. Rich Monaco residents drove alongside middle-class families from nearby towns. Marco and his team taught everyone the same lessons about safety and control. "Money doesn't make you a better driver," Marco told the mixed group during the safety briefing. "Respect for the car and understanding your limits makes you better." The event raised over €40,000 for homeless services. Local officials thanked Marco for bringing the community together for such an important cause. That evening, Louis found Marco sitting on his apartment balcony, looking out at the Mediterranean Sea. The letter from his father sat on the table beside him. "I've been thinking about what my father wrote," Marco said, "about racing for joy instead of expectations." "What about it?" Marco pulled out a business plan he had been working on for weeks. "I want to start something bigger, a program specifically for kids who can't afford racing lessons." Louis looked at the detailed plans. The program would teach young people about cars, safety, and following their dreams. But it wouldn't focus only on creating professional racers. The Gilles Villeneuve Youth Racing Program, Louis read from the cover page. "I want to honor my father by doing what he planned to do," Marco explained, "teaching young people about racing for the right reasons." Louis was impressed by Marco's vision. The program would emphasize education, character building, and creating opportunities for kids from all backgrounds. Some will become racers, others will become engineers or mechanics, Marco said. But all of them will learn that speed without wisdom is meaningless. "How will you fund it?" "I'll start small and build it slowly. Use money from my teaching job and donations from people who believe in the mission." Louis wanted to offer financial help, but he knew Marco needed to build this himself. It was important for Marco to prove he could succeed on his own terms. Over the following weeks, Marco worked to get permits and find sponsors for his youth program. Several local businesses offered support, impressed by Marco's reputation and the story of his recovery. The program launched on a Saturday morning with 12 students from Monaco's public schools. They ranged in age from 14 to 18, with different backgrounds and interests. Marco started by teaching them basic car maintenance, how to check oil, change tires, and understand what different engine sounds meant. "Cars are like people," Marco told the group. "They talk to you constantly. You just have to learn their language." After learning about car care, the students moved to go-karts on a small track. Marco emphasized safety above everything else. "Fast driving isn't about being brave," he explained. "It's about being smart and prepared." Some students showed natural driving talent and asked about competitive racing. Others became interested in the engineering side of cars. A few discovered they loved the business aspects of motorsports, but all of them learned confidence, discipline, and the importance of following safety rules. These were lessons that applied far beyond racing. At the end of the first month, the parents attended a demonstration day. They watched their children show off what they had learned about cars and driving. "My son talks about your program constantly," one mother told Marco. "He's never been this excited about anything before." Marco felt proud watching the young people explain car mechanics to their families. This was exactly what his father had wanted: racing education that built character, not just speed. Jacques arrived in Monaco the night before the Grand Prix. The brothers hadn't seen each other in person since before Marco's crash 10 years earlier. "You look healthy," Jacques said when they met at the airport. "I feel healthy," Marco replied. "Finally!" They spent the evening at Marco's apartment, talking about their father and sharing memories that felt different now. Instead of painful reminders of loss, these memories had become sources of strength. "Father would be proud of what you're doing," Jacques told Marco. "You found a way to be part of racing that's completely your own." The next morning, they walked to the Monaco Grand Prix together. For Marco, it felt like coming full circle. Hibao White was back in the racing world, but on his own terms, with his own purpose. As they took their seats in the grandstand, Marco felt grateful for everything that had led him to this moment. The crash, the drinking, the years on the street, even finding Lewis under that bridge, it had all been necessary to bring him here. He was no longer trying to be Gilles Villeneuve's son, the racing champion. He was Marco Villeneuve, the teacher, and that was enough. 1 year after Lewis found Marco under the bridge in Monaco, they returned to that same spot. But this time, it was intentional. Marco wanted to see the place where his new life had begun. The old stone bridge looked exactly the same. Water still dripped from the ancient stones. Expensive yachts still floated in the harbor nearby. But everything felt different now. "I was so angry that night," Marco remembered, standing where he used to sleep. "Angry at my father for dying. Angry at myself for failing. Angry at the world for expecting me to be someone I couldn't be." Lewis looked at the bridge, then at his friend. Marco was wearing a clean Monaco Racing Academy shirt and jeans that fit properly. His eyes were bright and confident. "What changed?" Lewis asked, though he knew the answer. "You listened," Marco said simply. "You didn't try to fix me or give me advice. You just listened and let me figure it out." They walked through Monaco's narrow streets, past the harbor where million-dollar yachts sat next to racing memorabilia shops. Marco pointed out landmarks. From his new life. "That's my apartment building," Marco said, gesturing toward a modest white structure. "And there's the racing school where I work." Lewis smiled, seeing how proud Marco was of his simple, honest life. Success didn't always mean trophies and fame. At Monaco Racing Academy, Marco introduced Lewis to his newest group of students. The weekend youth program had grown to include 24 young people from across the region. Among them was Sophie, the girl who had been afraid of driving fast. She was now one of Marco's assistant instructors, helping even newer students learn the basics. "Marco taught me that speed isn't about being reckless," Sophie told Lewis. "It's about being in complete control." Lewis watched Marco work with a nervous 14-year-old boy named Antoine, who reminded him of Marco when they first met. The boy was defensive and angry, claiming he didn't need to learn anything. "My family has money," Antoine said dismissively. "I can buy my way into racing." Marco didn't get upset. Instead, he took Antoine to a quiet corner of the workshop, where a display case held one of Gilles Villeneuve's old racing helmets. "My father was one of the fastest drivers who ever lived," Marco told Antoine calmly. "But you know what made him truly special? He treated everyone with respect. Speed without character is just noise. Antoine looked at the helmet, then at Marco, with new interest. People say you used to be homeless. That's right, Marco replied without shame. I lost everything because I forgot who I was supposed to be. This program exists to help people, like you figure that out before you make the same mistakes. Louis watched as Marco's patient teaching slowly broke through Antoine's defensive walls. Over the following hour, the angry teenager became curious about car mechanics and asked thoughtful questions about racing safety. After the lesson, Louis and Marco sat in the small cafe where they often had coffee. Through the window, they could see Monaco's famous street circuit being prepared for next month's Grand Prix. I have news, Marco said, pulling out an official-looking letter. The International Federation of Motorsport wants to hire me. Louis looked surprised. For what? To develop a global safety and ethics curriculum for young drivers. They want me to travel to racing schools around the world, teaching my methods. Louis felt excited for his friend, but also concerned. That's incredible. But it means leaving Monaco. Marco nodded. I would have to travel constantly. But I could help thousands of young drivers learn to race responsibly instead of just a few dozen. Here, what did you tell them? I said yes, but with conditions. I want to keep my programs here in Monaco running, and I refuse to endorse any specific racing series or car manufacturers. This has to be about education, not business. Louis admired Marco's principles. Even with this amazing opportunity, he was staying true to his mission of helping people rather than making money. When do you start? Next month. My first assignment is developing safety programs for racing schools in Italy and Spain. That evening, Marco organized a celebration dinner for his youth program students and their families. The event was held at the racing school, with tables set up next to the cars and trophies. Louis watched as parents thanked Marco for the positive changes they'd seen in their children. Kids who had been shy were now confident. Teenagers who had been angry were now focused on goals. Before your program, my daughter had no direction, one father told Marco. Now she wants to study automotive engineering at university. Another parent added, my son was getting into trouble at school. Working with cars and learning about safety gave him something positive to focus on. Jacques had flown in from Canada for the celebration. The brothers now talked every week and visited each other regularly. I keep thinking about what our father would say if he could see this, Jacques told Louis during the dinner. What do you think he would say? Jacques watched Marco explaining car safety to a group of fascinated teenagers. He would say Marco found the best way to be fast by helping others find their speed. Near the end of the evening, Marco stood up to address the group. He held his father's letter in his hands. 1 year ago, I was living under a bridge in Tianjin, this city, Marco began. I had lost everything because I was trying to be someone I wasn't. The room was completely quiet. Even the youngest students listened carefully. My father left me a letter before he died. For years, I was afraid to read it because I thought it would disappoint me. But when I finally found the courage to open it, I learned that he wanted me to be myself, not a copy of him. Marco looked around the room at all the young faces watching him. That's what we teach here. Not how to be the next Lewis Hamilton or Charles Leclerc. We teach you how to be the best version of yourself. The room erupted in applause. Louis felt proud watching his friend inspire the next generation of racing enthusiasts. After the guests left, Louis helped Marco clean up the racing school. They worked in comfortable silence, putting away chairs and washing dishes. Remember, when you asked me what changed, Marco said as they finished, I told you that you listened. But there was something else. What? You treated me like family before you even knew who I was. You saw a homeless man under a bridge, and instead of walking away, you sat down in your expensive suit. Louis thought about that rainy night a year ago. I just did what felt right. That's what made the difference. You showed me that racing people really do take care of each other. They walked back through Monaco's streets toward their apartments, the same route they had taken that first night. But everything was different now. I have something for you, Marco said when they reached Louis's building. Marco handed Louis a small wrapped package. Inside was a photograph of Gilles Villeneuve, winning the Monaco Grand Prix in 1981, signed with a message. For Lewis Hamilton, who showed me that the best victories happen off the track. Thank you for bringing me home. Marco Villeneuve. Louis felt touched by the gesture. Thank you, but you brought yourself home. I just walked with you part of the way. As they said goodnight, both men knew their friendship had changed both of their lives. Louis had been reminded why he loved racing. It was about pushing limits and never giving up. Marco had learned that there were many ways to be part of the racing family. Standing outside his apartment building, Louis looked back toward the Rhe harbor, where he had found Marco that stormy night. Sometimes the most important races were the ones where you helped someone else cross the finish line. Marco was now ready for his next adventure, traveling the world to teach young drivers about safety and character. But he would always carry his father's letter with him, reminding him that love was more important than speed. The bridge where they first met would always be special to both of them, not because it was where Marco had been lost, but because it was where he had been found. 2 years after that rainy night encounter, Marco's youth racing program had become famous throughout Europe. The Gilles Villeneuve youth racing program now operated in 8 countries, with over 300 young people participating each year. Marco traveled constantly for his job with the International Federation of Motorsport, but he always returned to Monaco to teach his original students. The small racing school had become a headquarters for a movement that was changing how young people learned about racing. Louis often joined Marco at the program's annual graduation ceremony. This year, 12 students were completing their 2-year course and moving on to various automotive careers. Sophie, now 18, had been accepted to study mechanical engineering at a university in Germany. She planned to work in Formula One someday, but as an engineer rather than a driver. Marco taught me that there are many ways to be fast, Sophie told the audience during her graduation speech. You can be fast with your hands fixing cars, fast with your mind solving problems, or fast with your heart helping others. Antoine, the angry teenager who had once claimed money could buy racing success, was now one of the program's most dedicated students. He had learned car mechanics and was planning to open his own garage specializing in racing car preparation. I'd used to think speed was about being better than everyone else, Antoine said when Louis asked about his plans. Now I know it's about being the best version of yourself. These transformations happened over and over again. Young people who came to the program angry, scared, or directionless left with confidence, skills, and clear goals for their futures. But the program's success created new challenges. Major automotive companies wanted to sponsor it, offering millions of euros for the right to put their logos on the cars and equipment. Marco turned down every offer. Why? Louis asked, when Marco told him about refusing another lucrative sponsorship deal. That money could help you expand the program even more. Because then it becomes about selling cars instead of helping kids, Marco explained. I've seen what happens when racing becomes too commercial. The human element gets lost. Instead of corporate sponsorship, Marco partnered with local vocational schools and community colleges. Students could earn real certifications in automotive technology while learning about racing safety and ethics. The program's reputation grew by word of mouth. Parents drove hundreds of kilometers to enroll their children. Racing professionals recommended it to friends and colleagues. Charles Leclerc, who had taken that first lesson from Marco 3 years earlier, became an unofficial ambassador for the program. He often visited to speak with students about the IDE, mental aspects of racing. Marco saved my relationship with my younger brother, Charles told the students during one visit. The teaching techniques I learned from him helped me understand how to share knowledge without creating pressure. Sebastian Vettel also remained involved, helping Marco develop advanced curricula for older students. The program now offered courses ranging from basic car maintenance for beginners to advanced race engineering for teenagers planning automotive careers. But Marco's greatest pride remained the original Monaco location. Every Saturday morning, he still taught the basics to new students, just as he had when the program started with 12 kids. One Saturday, a familiar face appeared among the new students. It was James, the nervous businessman from London who had been Marco's first student at the racing school. "My son is 16 now," James explained to Marco. "I want him to learn from the same person who taught me to drive safely." James's son, Michael, was shy but eager to learn. Marco worked with him patiently, using the same techniques that had helped hundreds of other young people find confidence behind the wheel. "Your father was one of my first students," Marco told Michael during a break. "He taught me as much as I taught him." "What did he teach you?" Michael asked. Marco thought about the question. "He taught me that being a good teacher means helping people overcome their fears, not just showing them how to go fast." That afternoon, Lewis found Marco in his office at the racing school, working on plans for a new program location in Portugal. The walls were covered with photographs of students, letters from parents, and newspaper articles about the program's success. "You've built something incredible here," Lewis said, looking at all the evidence of lives changed and dreams encouraged. "We've built something incredible," Marco corrected. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped under that bridge." Lewis picked up a letter from a parent in Italy whose daughter had gained confidence through the program. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't walked that way that night?" "Every day," Marco replied. "But I also think about all the young people who are better drivers and better people, because you did walk that way." Marco showed Lewis his latest project, a mobile racing safety unit that could travel to schools in remote areas. Children who lived far from racing facilities could still learn about automotive technology and safe driving practices. The unit has simulators, basic tools, and educational materials, Marco explained. "We can bring the program to kids instead of waiting for them to come to us." The mobile unit was painted with the program's logo and motto, "Speed with Wisdom." It would visit rural schools throughout Southern Europe, introducing children to automotive careers they might never have considered. "My father wrote about racing for joy instead of expectations," Marco said, remembering the letter that had changed his life. "This mobile unit brings joy to places where it's never existed before." Lewis realized that Marco had accomplished something remarkable. He had created a legacy that honored his father while being completely his own achievement. That evening, they attended a ceremony at Monaco's City Hall. Marco was receiving an award for his contributions to youth education and automotive safety. The room was filled with racing personalities, local officials, and families whose children had benefited from the program. Jacques flew in from Canada to present the award to his brother. "Marco Villeneuve has shown us that there are many ways to be fast," Jacques said in his speech. "Sometimes the fastest route is the one that helps others find their way. When Marco accepted the award, he spoke briefly about the importance of finding your own path in life rather than trying to copy someone else's success. My father was a great racing driver, but more importantly, he was a great man who loved his family, Marco told the audience. The best way I can honor him is not by trying to win the races he won, but by helping others discover their own potential. After the ceremony, Lewis and Marco walked through Monaco's streets one final time. Marco was leaving the next day for a 3-month assignment, developing racing programs in South America. "Are you nervous about being away for so long?" Lewis asked. Marco looked back at the racing school where lights were still on in the workshop. Students were staying late to work on a special project, building a racing cart from scratch. "No," Marco said with confidence, "the program doesn't depend on me anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes in it." They reached the old bridge where their friendship had begun. It looked peaceful in the moonlight, with expensive yachts reflecting light across the calm harbor water. "Do you ever miss it?" Lewis asked. "Professional racing?" Marco considered the question seriously. "I miss the speed sometimes, but I found something better than being fast myself." "What's that?" "I found a way to help hundreds of people discover their own speed, whether that's driving, engineering, teaching, or just being confident in life." Lewis thought about his own racing career and the pressures of competition. Maybe that's what racing was always supposed to be about. Not just winning, but helping everyone become better. As they prepared to say goodbye, Marco pulled out his father's letter. He read a few lines silently, then looked up at Lewis. "My father wrote that the best victories are the ones you share with family," Marco said. "Thank you for showing me what racing family really means." Lewis felt honored to be considered part of Marco's family. Their friendship had reminded him why he loved racing in the first place. It was about pushing boundaries, helping others, and never giving up hope. 3 months later, Lewis received a postcard from Brazil. Marco had successfully launched racing safety programs in 6 South American countries. The message was simple: teaching kids in São Paulo tomorrow. They're fast here, but they want to learn wisdom too. Thank you for everything. Emmy Lewis smiled and pinned the postcard to his refrigerator next to photos of his own racing victories. Some accomplishments were measured in championship trophies. Others were measured in lives changed and dreams encouraged. Marco Villeneuve had found his true speed, and it was exactly fast enough. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and tell us your city or country. Are you from Monaco, London, New York, or somewhere completely different? It's amazing how stories like this can connect people from all around the world. If this story touched your heart and restored a little faith in humanity, please hit that like button. It really helps us know that these meaningful stories matter to you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories about real people making a difference. We share tales of kindness, courage, and hope that remind us what's truly important in life. Most importantly, please share this video with your friends and family. In a world that often feels divided, stories like Marco's show us that compassion and human connection can change everything. When we spread kindness and awareness, we create ripple effects that reach people who need hope the most. Because just like Lewis Hamilton walking past that bridge in Monaco, you never know when your simple act of caring might save someone's life. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the fastest way forward is by helping someone else find their path. Until next time, keep spreading kindness.